Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, thank you. I'm very happy that you could join us this evening. My name's Cynthia Harriet Sullivan, and I'm the Unite Rochester Justice Engagement Group Coordinator. So I'm very, very happy that this whole event is kicking off tonight, but I'm also relieved because it's been a lot of work. But certainly work that we just been more than happy to engage in. So what I'd like to do to get us started is I want to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to also introduce the committee, a lot of the folks that did some work behind the scenes, and then we'll go through some of the logistics for how the evening's going to go. If I could, I'm going to read off your names, and for my panelists, if you don't mind waving, we've got nameplates up, but I don't know if that were me sitting in the back. I don't know if I'd be able to see that. But if you don't mind giving a little wave so folks know who you are. First, I'd like to introduce Monroe County District Attorney Sandra Dorley, our Chief Public Defender Timothy Donaher, our very own Judge Stephen Miller. Thank you. Councilman McFadden is going to be joining us shortly. Monroe County Sheriff Patrick O'Flynn, Deputy Chief of the Rochester Police Department, Fred Bell, Reverend Ray Scott, our community activist. And we're also going to be joined shortly by Mayor Lovely Warren. So in addition to the folks I've named, certainly had a lot of hardworking people behind the scenes, so community members that we've had that have been a part of the process. But as far as the panel itself and helping to get this forum on track was you've met Raymond Scott, Reverend Ray Scott, you've met Judge Miller, you've met our District Attorney Sandra Dorley, and also our Public Defender Tim Donaher. But in addition to that, one person who could not be with us tonight was Under Sheriff Bill Sanborn. He had the opportunity for leadership training that he certainly couldn't pass up, so he couldn't be here with us tonight, but we certainly wish him well on that. And also we have Commander David Phelps with the Sheriff's Department, if you don't mind giving a little wave. Lieutenant Willie Jackson with the Rochester Fire Department, and also our own Fire Chief, John Schreiber. It's the Fire Chief's birthday today. He probably wouldn't have wanted me to mention that, but we we gave him a little cake earlier at luncheon, so I just kind of wanted to mention that because he's really been a very hard worker behind the scenes. But one thing I want to mention is that I would have to say that this group, the committee, really taught me a lot about commitment and sacrifice. Certainly, even though they're at the heads of their agencies, everybody left their ego at the door, if they even had one, because I didn't see it. But we had a really great grassroots mentality and atmosphere. Everybody chipped in. The constant question was, what do you need? Everybody brought their A game, whatever resources they had to bring to the table, certainly. They brought that and then some. So if you don't mind joining me, and I'd like to thank them from the bottom of my heart for all their hard work and support. Now, I also want to thank Senator Schumer, who could not be here this evening, but he was very instrumental in bringing us Ronald L. Davis, our guest speaker moderator, who he is the director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services in Washington, D.C. Ron and I served on the board of NOBLE together a little while back. That's the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. He is a former police chief. In your attendee package, you're going to see his bio, so I can't take up the lengthy time to read all of his accolades and his experience, but we're certainly happy that he's here today. Thank you very much. In your busy schedule, you made time for us. And not only that, but at lunch today, we had some nice conversations. He was very impressed with, some of the things Rochester has done to take the lead on an issue like this, and he's offered us some resources. So I'm certainly happy to accept that. What I'd like to do is call up James Lawrence. He's the editor with the Democrat and Chronicle. He also is the coordinator of the Unite Justice. Well, not just the Unite Justice, but the Unite process period. So he's really been a big guide, very helpful, a big brother behind the scenes for me. The tons of emails I sent, all the questions I asked, the demands I made when I might have a meltdown occasionally because I was getting a little stressed out. He was right there to kind of say, hey, it's all right, everything's going to be fine. So, but also, if you hadn't heard yet, Jim is about to retire. And so he's not aware of this. This is something we were planning as a surprise to him. But if you would come up, Jim, please. What we have here is we put out a report a little while back on the progress of the Unite process, and there was a specific page that went to the justice section. So what we did was I worked with your Vice President Karen. She knows about it. Told her to keep it a secret. And what we did was everyone from Unite Justice, we signed it, and we had a copy framed for you. And so just want to really wish you the best. And certainly you know that I'm not going to stop calling you. But what I do want to confess to is I really did honestly have this in a nice, perfectly fitting frame, and last night I cracked it by mistake. And so I grabbed my purse. I went running out the door. My husband's like, what's wrong? What's the matter? Is there an emergency? Who's sick? I said, I got to go to Walmart. So I got this as a temporary replacement, but I know it doesn't match, but I just wanted to explain to you what happened.
Oh, that's fine. That's great. Well, thank you.
But, I love you, wish you the best, and we sincerely, from the bottom of my hearts, we really want to thank you for the leadership you provided us.
Well, thank you.
All right?
Thank you. Give me a hug. Thank you. These are really some special people, and Cynthia, I can't tell you just how much she means to me personally and to this whole Unite Rochester effort. And she has worked just so hard, and so she has been so diligent, and someone who really believes in what we're trying to accomplish. And I know that, with her continued leadership, that we will be successful. Thank you, Cynthia. On behalf of our publisher, Michael Kane at the Democrat and Chronicle, and Karen Magnuson, who is the editor of the Democrat and Chronicle, first, I just want to thank Ron Davis, who I met earlier at a luncheon this afternoon. I want to welcome you to Rochester. As I may have mentioned to you at the luncheon, Rochester is the home of American icons like Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. They are true icons of our drum majors for justice in this country. And that really drives to the heart of what Unite Rochester is all about. And we're trying to revive that sense of purpose and of willingness and community to do the right thing. Because in our community, unfortunately, inequities when it comes to race and when it comes to economics, they still persist. So with that, and with this panel that Cynthia has and the community leaders who are participating, we are set out to really make a difference here. Tonight's event will be more than, as we said in our editorial this morning, it's more than just a talk fest, and we've all been to those. We sit around the table and we break off into groups and we come back together and we report, and nothing ever really happens. Well, tonight is going to be different. We're going to make that different. We've charged our committees to make that happen, and we're looking for viable solutions to change the way that this community operates. We can no longer operate as business as usual. So, with that, and I'm not going to preach to you, but I do want you to know that this is something that's very different. And I think you even acknowledged that, Mr. Davis, at our luncheon today, about what's happening here in Rochester is different from what's happening elsewhere around the country, because we're not so much responding to, and I know that you are playing a key role in Ferguson, Missouri. We're not so much responding to that as we have for the past more than 2 years. We have been bringing these folks together and trying to address many of these problems in a systemic kind of way. So with that, again, welcome, and thanks to the committee for your hard work and pulling this together, and thanks to my good friend and, yes, my fellow church member. She's at Bayberry AME Church. That's a little plug from a church. She really just did a stellar job and continues to do so, and will keep moving forward. So thanks again for this gift, and we're going to get to work.
Thank you. I'm going to get you a better frame, too, I promise. So, as we talked about this and made our plans and kind of debated on what our goal and purpose was, something was said by one of the members, and I tried to capture it as best I could. And they said that we're attempting to give you a baseline for what's appropriate across the criminal justice process. And I would say that probably comes close to kind of capturing what our goal is for being here today. And also I wanted to point out that on your attendee packets, that little quote that's at the bottom, that was written by our own Judge Miller, because he made the comment during a meeting we were having, and that really also captured how we felt about this whole forum and the process moving forward. But what I really appreciate is that, like, a week later, I emailed him and I said, can you repeat that exactly how you said it so I can use it and put it on the program? And he was able to do that, so I appreciate it. The other thing I want to make you aware of is in how we structured this forum. Those of you who are sitting out there in the audience are specifically people from different types of groups and nonprofits that we know are out there and connected to the community in different ways. And we wanted your diversity of thought, wanted your feedback. So when we reached out to you to ensure that you'd be here today and invited you to submit certain questions. So you're going to hear some of that. You're all going to hear some of the questions that we as a committee put together, because we were trying to be as provoking as possible and thoughtful in how we put out our process and scenario to you. Now, in a little bit, Commander Phelps is going to go over the scenario with you, and I want to stress that our goal was to be provocative. We wanted to encourage discussion. We did chip in with different ideas, and we made some changes. It is in Anytown, USA. We didn't pick a particular city, and we didn't want something that was so simply one party in the scenario was clearly right or wrong. Our goal was to be provocative, so I wanted to stress that to you. But also that these were different things that in our experiences across the board from all the members of the panel that we've known and dealt with, or these are complaints or questions people have had. So we were trying to, like I said, be realistic and cover different areas of experience that people have had, but we also really wanted to provoke discussion. So I want to mention quickly, before I have the mayor come up and introduce our guest speaker, just kind of cover a few ground rules. We've gone over this with the committee, but I mention it for your benefit that we've got different questions that are based upon a scenario that would have been given out to you as you came in. And you should have your own copy of it. That's the one I just mentioned and discussed with you. And the questions we're going to submit, I'm going to be asking of the panel, are based on that scenario. So, but in addition to that, we had a couple of community members that did submit questions for the panel, and so we're going to throw those in there too and ask. What I'd like to do is ask the committee, we've discussed this, but if we could be as succinct as possible so that we can get to as many questions as possible. That's just how we're going to operate. We know we're not going to be able to solve all the issues in this 2-hour space, but what we were trying to do was involve as much as the community as possible, but also to give a voice to what we knew as people who've dealt with this process for years, what some of the critical issues were. So, unless there are questions, I'd like to introduce our mayor, Lovely Warren. If you would come, please, and introduce our speaker. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm so excited to participate in this lively discussion that we're going to have tonight. I want to acknowledge some elected officials here, Council President Loretta Scott, Councilmember Elaine Spa, County Legislator Cindy Cayley is here, and I'm not sure if I missed anybody, but I want to make sure that I acknowledge them. So good evening, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to Unite Rochester Justice Committee for organizing this event. Tonight's guest speaker, Mr. Ronald L. Davis, was appointed by Attorney General Eric Holder in November of last year to head the Office of Community Policing Services of the U.S. Department of Justice. The Office of Community Policing Services, or COPS, is responsible for advancing community policing nationwide and supporting the community policing activities of state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies. At the request of Attorney General Director Davis recently spent time in Ferguson, Missouri, during the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting. Prior to this appointment, he served the city of East Palo Alto as chief of police for 8 years. Before becoming chief, Davis served 20 years with the Oakland Police Department, where he rose to the rank of captain. In East Palo Alto, Davis led an organizational reform community policing effort that increased public trust and confidence in the police and achieved dramatic crime and violence reductions in a city once named the murder capital of the United States. Over a 6-year period, homicides dropped by over 50%. Overall, crime decreased over 20%, and police and community relations dramatically improved. He has worked closely with DOJ in the past, serving as a policing expert for the Department's Civil Rights Division. While in this capacity, he served on 2 federal monitoring teams with oversight of police reform consent decrees between the DOJ and Washington, D.C., and Detroit Police Departments. He is the co-author of a Harvard University and National Institute of Justice publication exploring the role of the police in prisoner reentry, and the Department of Justice publication, How to Correctly Collect and Analyze Racial Profiling Data. Your reputation depends on it, as well as a contributing author to the Police Executive Research Forum publications. Davis has served on numerous boards and advisory committees and possesses a Bachelor of Science degree from Southern Illinois University, and he has completed the Senior Executives in State and Local Government program at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. I cannot think of a more qualified individual to lead us in this discussion tonight at this inaugural Unite Rochester Community Forum. Please join me in the honor of welcoming Mr. Ronald L. Davis, head of the Office of Community-Oriented Police Services of the United States Department of Justice, to City Hall. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and it's good to see you again. I was sharing with the folks at lunch that I think the last time we talked was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and let me just say that when you're the director of the COPS office, it's one of those very popular positions because we put out several $100 million of grants every year. And so the mayor tracked me down, found me, and to make sure that I knew where Rochester was at with regards to grants, and she is definitely a strong advocate for the best interest of the city. So it's good to see you again, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Cynthia, for the invitation. And for those, I've known Cynthia for, it has to be close to 12 years now, when we served on a board together, and I see she has not changed. I see you still cannot tell her no. And I see she still gets everything that she wants and that she works hard for doing. And I didn't put the name together, candidly, until I showed up today at the lunch and saw this with the Cynthia they're talking about. But I kept wondering, who the heck is this that somehow started a phone call with the Attorney General to where I'm being called saying you need to go to Rochester and participate. And then my team is telling me, Cynthia wants this, Cynthia wants that, make sure you're doing this. And when I walked in, I go, oh, okay, got it. So thank you. It's good to see you again. I'm really honored to be here for several reasons. And it was mentioned about my being dispatched to Ferguson. But really, I think when we talk about this tonight and we get into discussion, whether it's a scenario, whether it's Ferguson, we need to put it in a context of being really symbolizing any city USA. Because one thing we know that this can occur in any city in this country, and quite frankly, is simmering in many cities across this country. So I'm going to start with the story to kind of give an idea of what frames my thought and why I do what I do and why this is important. So as mentioned before, I spent 20 years in Oakland, which is a very beautiful, diverse city of about 400, maybe 20,000. And I enjoyed a very productive law enforcement career there. And then I was asked to become chief of the city of East Palo Alto, which is a very much smaller community, about at that time maybe about 40,000, probably even smaller than that right now. And what was interesting, both communities very diverse. East Palo Alto is about 94% of color, primarily about a 62% Hispanic population, rapidly growing about a 28% African American, and a rapidly growing Pacific Islander. 10 years before, it was about 65% African American, so there's some major demographic shifts. Oakland at one point, probably about 60% of color, with a large African American and Latino populations. And I think back in my career, going back to 28 years, and I started when I was about 2. So for those who just caught that, I think back in that career of how policing has changed and the challenges we face have changed and where we're at today. And it probably, when I became chief, I never forget, I got a meeting from a gentleman who was a formerly incarcerated, he used to call himself a consumer of correctional services, which was a nice way of saying formerly incarcerated. And he came and he said, I need to talk with you, Chief, and I want to set a meeting with you. Now, initially, my tenure in the 80s taught me that, okay, well, you're a parolee, so therefore, you're pretty much born a criminal, you're going to stay a criminal, and you will never change, and that's the way it's supposed to go. But I'll sit there and talk to you for a couple of minutes, so since people think you're somewhat a community leader. And I remember telling my secretary at the time, I said, well, look, when this brother comes in here, come get me in about 15 minutes. I got some meeting I must go to. Just make sure it's something. Just get me out of here. I'm going to give him his 15 minutes, and that's the end of the conversation. So that lasted about an hour and a half, and every time the person came in, I kicked him out because this young man at the time, and at the time he has since passed away, he was in his 40s, started changing the way I started thinking about policing. And it came to, and I'm going to share the story because it may be relevant, it came to a test about 3 months after I met him. And now I'm about 6 months as a brand new chief, and I get the phone call that no chief in his or her tenure ever wants to receive. It's the worst phone call you can ever receive. And that is, Chief, we have an officer that's shot and down. And my officer was shot and killed by a gentleman who was out of jail for out of prison for about 3 months. And so now as a chief, I have this road, I have this dilemma. I could literally and justifiably in many ways, legally at least, declare war on a segment of the community that was responsible, or at least in our minds, for taking my officer. How dare they take one of the officers in blue that's protected to do so? Or we could ask the question of what would cause somebody 3 months out of jail to be walking around with a gun. Now, I was lucky in having met this guy before that was the consumer of correctional services that got me thinking about maybe we need to do something different in policing. Maybe we need to look at different ways of responding to problems because and he talked about this issue of reentry. And I don't know if you guys are into reentry here, but I remember when he says, well, do you do prisoner reentry? And I start thinking about my Oakland days, and not so much an indictment on Oakland, but an indictment on the way I was thinking then. And of course I do reentry. My job is to reenter everybody back into prison that comes out. That's reentry program. It's a very effective program. So the family of the slain officer had the same question, why? We end up doing a reentry program that instead of doing mass incarceration, we provided services and job skill training, employment, cognitive life skills training, rehabilitation, things that would change the trajectory of those that are coming out of prison to reconnect them back into their communities. And I share that because that is the essence of community policing to me when I then met with the Attorney General about this position. And it goes, what is the goal of the COPS office? Is to advance community policing. It is to look at the way we now solve problems as a community and to address them. It is the acknowledgement, in my opinion, it's time for us to acknowledge that many of our strategies, our reentry strategies, the way we police, whether well-intended or not, have done nothing less than to destroy communities of color. That this really disparate incarceration rate that we have in this country should be a national embarrassment. We must we kind of address it, and we must stop it. We also know that we're not going to arrest our way out of crime. We know that we're going to have to find solutions that go beyond that. And so when I look at now places as the COPS director, places like Ferguson, well, the issues in Ferguson and in many other communities are much larger than the tragic shooting of a young man, Michael Brown. That has been simmering for generations and for decades. And so the question I would ask all communities is it simmering in your backyards? How hot is the temperature in your neighborhood? The other thing that stands out as I travel around the country in many communities, there are actually 2 or not 3 different cities within a city. And in many cases, people don't even realize that there are 2 cities. Those who have influence, those who are privileged, sometimes do not see that you still have a very large segment that is disenfranchised, that is disengaged, and that the criminal justice system has failed to serve with equity. And so we need to have equity. When I look at the Ferguson issues right now, I think this is a defining moment in American history. This is a movement like I have not seen since I was a young boy in the 60s, to where it's sustaining, where people are basically saying they want something different. And quite frankly, the community, and in many cases, my law enforcement brothers and sisters are very much aligned with wanting to provide something different. So when I start seeing things like Unite Rochester, Unite whatever city that is, then it tells me we're on the right track. When you have players at the table that would include your district attorney, your sheriff, the chief public defender, when you have law enforcement saying we also want to serve and do things different, this is a defining moment. The tragedy that comes out of shooting cannot just be the demonstrations that grab the attention. It must be the changes that come out of it as a result of it. Let that be the phoenix of change, that things will be different. How we police are different. How young men of color look at the chief right there in uniform will be different. How I, as a father, will not have to give my 17-year-old son a special class of what to do when stopped by the police because he's a young man of color. Let all of that be the past because of things that are going to change. This is the defining moment of our era. And so as you guys proceed forward, you know, you're dealing with it because of your love and your excitement for the city of Rochester. And I don't want to add a national burden to you, Madam Mayor, and to the leadership here, but the nation is watching. And we need united Rochesters, united Oaklands, we need united Ferguson, St. Louis counties. We need united all over this country, and this is the time to do it. It's a very interesting thing when you start looking at the criminal justice system from the eyes of young men, and particularly young men of color. One of the greatest lessons we're learning through the research right now is that how people view the criminal justice system is how they actually equates to the level of trust that they have in the system itself. And so why people comply with the law is not because of the fear of the police, it's because of their respect of the police. Why people don't violate their neighbors is not because of the fear of the police, it's because of the respect of the community values that you share together as a community. Why people comply with the law is because they believe the law is fair, that the enforcement is equitable, and that they have a fair opportunity to grieve their concerns and to be heard. And so as you build these systems, as you rebuild them, whether it is in a prosecution, whether it is in defense, whether it is in incarceration, whether it is on a car stop in the middle of the night, We have to give voice to the community so that they have a way to grieve, a way to make concerns, a way to understand that the system is here to serve them. So this process that you guys have undertaken is very important, and it's going to be, if not already, a model. I really look forward to watching it. I think it's going to be important as we proceed forward. And I tell you, as a director of the COPS office, it really, as I look at agencies all over the country, I would say that this really puts you in a very good stead of leadership. Now, I think it was the editor, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, shared with me at lunch about this very strong and unique history, and mentioned Susan B. Anthony, and I think there were some others that I'm going to, Frederick Douglass. And what I share with them is that with a history like that, then you have a moral mandate to lead. You cannot come from such history, such rich diversity, and not think that there's a mandate, that there's an obligation that goes with that. And that obligation is to lead. It is to basically show that communities can come together. This crowd today is very impressive because it's very diverse. And that's what uniting is about. In that when we look at the troubles of any communities, because it affects all of our communities. And so I will leave you with the charge, if I may. This is a defining moment. For those in law enforcement, for those in public service, this is a couple steps that we have to do. One, I think we must acknowledge that whether it was well-intended or not, that many, not all of it, or some of our strategies have contributed to the disparate incarceration rate of young men of color and have caused people in communities, especially distressed communities and communities of color, to distrust the police and the criminal justice system. Two, we have to give a full commitment to come to the table and sit with stakeholders that typically and traditionally we do not sit down with. The loudest critic should be sitting right next to you. The loudest supporter can be sitting next to you. Civil rights organizations, faith organizations, community-based organizations, youth. Let the young people have a voice and not speak for them, and you'll be surprised what they tell you, which I'm sure you already know. Three, we need the community to step forward and say that even despite this history, I can probably find 5,000 reasons not to sit down with the chief, but the one that's going to make me sit down with him is in the best interest of Rochester. It's going to be the best interest of this country. So we have to basically come to the middle together to sit down, to reconcile our differences, to find solutions to the problems, and actually start making the criminal justice system better, responsive, and fair to those that we serve. It is, like I said, I didn't mean to put the burden of a nation on you or to suggest that if you don't do it right, that something else goes wrong around the country. But once again, with such a rich history, the burden is on you. So this is exciting. When I was looking into the concept of Unite Rochester, the history, it hit me right now that this is really, this is the year of anniversaries as well, if I believe. So the COPS office, which I get to lead, is now 20 years old. And just 2 days ago, we had a very nice celebration that we call the Great Hall of Justice at the Main Justice Department in Washington, D.C. My boss, the Attorney General, was there speaking about the legacy of the department, about the next 20 years, about his contributions to it, because as you know, he's stepping down and resigning, and about the future with if the president's nominee, Loretta Lynch, is confirmed, where she's going to take it. And so it was a good moment, 20 years celebration of the COPS office. This is also the 50th year anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 50th anniversary or mark of the race riots of Rochester. This is many things. 2 days ago was 1 year anniversary of me being a Fed. Side note, this is the federal suit, by the way, if you haven't figured it out. I was teasing somebody, once you become a federal employee, it's either black, gray, or dark blue, right? And the best you can play with is your tie, so my wife hooked me up with a pink tie today, and I'll see how that works and go from there. But that's the federal look, so you know that. So this is the 1 year anniversary for me as being a federal employee and being appointed to serve in the Obama administration, which, as you can imagine, is the greatest honor of my professional career. And so this is a very significant period of time. I think these anniversaries are not coincidental. I think this really does provide us a very, very unique opportunity. But what I would tell every community and every community that's listening, what we get out of it is what you put in it. And that the people that's at the dais right now that are sitting up here cannot do it alone, that they need you, they need the rest of the community, they need young people. We need to put things to the side and we move forward with this idea of unite. And I just think that is such a great title. I think it is such a good mandate. It is a great vision. And it's something that I will take back and share with the Justice Department and share with you over 13,000 to 15,000 law enforcement agencies that are in this country. Because right now we're trying to figure out what will community policing look like, Madam Mayor, for the next 20 years. What do we mean when we say community policing? Is it a program? Is it a philosophy? Is it a couple officers that walk a beat? Or is it what we're looking at right here, right now? People coming together to solve problems, to work through problems, and have discussions that 5 years ago we would not have. To talk about issues of race, to talk about issues of policing, to talk about racial profiling, to talk about excessive force, to talk about incarceration rates, to be smart on crime. These are the discussions we're going to have. These are the discussions that you guys are leading, so I applaud you for that effort. I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to any questions you may have. And once again, I'm humbled to be here. It's good to see some good friends again, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Director. That was excellent. Wow, you made me sound important. Holders calling on my behalf? Wow. No, thank you. We really, Jim Lawrence and I discussed it. I mean, we were given some names, and I told him, I said, that's who we want. That's who we got to have. And it was perfect, and I'm certainly glad it all worked out. So, next I want to call up Commander Phelps with the Monroe County Sheriff's Department. See, Dave had a great way of giving me suggestions on what we need to do, but then you know what, when it was time to write that stuff out, so I couldn't find him. So we worked well together, though, right?
Yes, we do, ma'am.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Mr. Davis, you are correct. She's not changed. She's a very direct woman, and she does not take no easily. So it's Cynthia has been a great friend of the Sheriff's Office in very short term. One of the goals the Sheriff has had for us, as I became commander a couple years ago, I oversee recruitment training amongst other things, and the Sheriff first day says one of the things we need to improve on is diversity of our hiring. Over the last 2 years, we've met with any community group that's willing to listen, offer suggestions, work very closely with the City Fire Department. They had some great ideas. We worked very closely with Bogan Vargas and City School District and the Pathways of Public Safety Program. We worked very close with Mr. Lawrence and the Democrat and Chronicle. And recently we had the opportunity to bring somebody to audit our system, look at what we do and how it works. And I believe it's through the mayor's office in Unite Rochester that under sheriff says, hey, I want you to meet this Cynthia Harriet. Heard a lot of good things about her. She's very impressive. She has a lot of experience in working with diversity and racial issues around the country, and I think she might be able to add something to our dialogue. So the undersheriff and I met with Cynthia, and it was really an awesome experience. A very unbelievable amount of knowledge, caring, consideration. She then met with us at our recruitment office, evaluated our entire program, and so I want to thank Cynthia not only for your openness and honesty and your friendship, but what you did to get all these people in the room, to pull him out of his warm home, to bring him to Rochester on our first snow day of the year. I think that was classic. But I want to thank you very much. So if you just give me a hand, help with a hand for Cynthia. Cynthia's put together a very unique team, as you see here on the panel, as well as the committee, that it's been an extreme pleasure for myself to be a part of, along with the undersheriff. Sheriff Pat O'Flynn is very active in the community, and if there's a committee he's not on, he is more than willing to donate the undersheriff, myself, or the chief deputy. So I thank you, Sheriff, for putting me on this one. It's been great. During the committee meetings, and what I'm hoping we get out of this event today is a little bit of trust building. It's one thing to talk about delicate, challenging issues between law enforcement and citizen contacts. It's another thing to actually act on it and to listen to each other and have open dialogue. And what's happened with this particular Unite Committee, and I can tell you conversations I've had with Reverend Scott, Honorable Judge Miller, have been very, very interesting, very, I think, enlightening for all of us. And we've developed friendships that will continue beyond this. We've been able to discuss things that quite frankly, I don't know that we ever would have met. And I wish we'd have had a video camera in some of these panel meetings discussing the topic. Cynthia wanted to have a 5-minute discussion about the topic. An hour later, the district attorney, the public defender, the honorable judge, Reverend Scott, myself, the undersheriff, couldn't get off the first point. what it was going to be. So I don't know if this will go that well and have that energy. I hope it does. But that is our desire as we move on. And what I want to add to this before I get into the scenario is, when you leave here today, committees and meetings and groups are great. They're great for discussion. But if it's just talk, and I can tell you from law enforcement side, we don't have time for just talk. We're action people. We're very action-oriented. As is Cynthia, it's why I love her so much. It's where you go with it. And what we found with some of these Unite meetings, this one and many of the other committees that we're on, is not necessarily just the success of the committee, it's the networking that goes on. It's the people that you meet. It's the relationships. You talked about reentry. The Sheriff's Office is very aggressive in the reentry program. Sheriff's Office is the only law enforcement body that touches an offender 4 times. We have a police bureau that engages the offender during the time when they're committing the crime or they're on that path of becoming a criminal at the home front. We work in the court security with the judges and monitor and protect them in the court security program. The Civil Bureau hands out levies and fees and tries to recover money for victims of violence and crime. And finally, the Jail Bureau spends most of the time with inmates more than any part of the Sheriff's Office. It's the jail deputies. And the compassion that I've seen out of our jail deputies is absolutely stunning. We recently had an event out at the correctional facility. Legislator Kaylee honored us with her presence. Cynthia was there, honoring graduates, getting their GED, getting job skills, getting training, so that when they leave the correctional facility, all of which is at no cost to the county, it all comes from volunteers and donations and just great work of some of our legislators. We're able to help those people in the committee. So while we're on these committees, we have a whole other group of people. Their sole job is networking to find job placement, to find places like Hope Initiatives, local business where the gentleman gave up his career at FedEx so that he could open up a business where his sole job is training indigent people and inmates how to do carpentry and welding, get their certificate. So we linked him with our jail, and he now comes in, meets inmates, brings them out. They get trained by him, and then he connects them to a job afterward. The problem he had is he didn't have any housing. So within these networking of our committees, we found a housing facility in the city of Rochester that provides drug addiction counseling along with the housing. So we linked them together, so now they have a place to stay while they learn that job skill. So I am completely with you, sir, on reentry. The sheriff has made that a priority for us. And at the end of the day, we've got to deal with the side and the crime side, but we can't forget about them. We've got to work on the back side to make sure that they don't reoffend. So I thank you for your comments. Finally, I want to thank we had lunch today. I want to thank the Sheriff's Foundation. Continues to step up. They provided funding for our event. We brought the community into the correctional facility. They provided funding for the lunch today, which was fantastic. And I also want to thank the American Association of University Women, who invited us into their home today and provided us with a location for the lunch and the conversation we had today. So we're very grateful to have them. So now on to the scenario and the beginning of why we're all here. As Cynthia said, the scenario we picked, we chose to have some controversy in it because you don't have discussion if everything works out right. So as I go through it, Cynthia will then come up and then lead the panel discussion from there. So here's the scenario that we're going to discuss today. In any town, USA, a law enforcement officer pulls over a vehicle after observing that one of the adult passengers in the front seat is not wearing a seatbelt. In addition to the male driver, there is a female passenger and a 12-year-old girl who's seatbelted in the back seat. The officer asked the driver, John Smith, for his license and proof of insurance was provided. A second officer arrived and positions himself on the passenger side of the vehicle. He then asked the passenger, Cynthia Johnson, for identification. The officers then instruct all passengers to exit the vehicle. The passenger and driver refused this request and remained inside the vehicle. Ms. Johnson initially declined to provide identification, but subsequently stated that she did not have anything because of her only identification was her driver's license, which had been suspended. She offered to provide proof of this explanation. She then reached for her purse, which is located in the rear floor of the vehicle. Throughout this time, the police officers continue to insist that all passengers must exit the vehicle. It is at this point that the officers on scene draw their weapons and point them at Ms. Johnson and Mr. Smith in order for them not to move. Mr. Smith had earlier dialed 911 from his cell phone and requested a police supervisor and was on the line with them while this was all occurring. Mr. Smith expressed reluctance to get out of the vehicle due to what he described as being the officer's over-aggressiveness. After stating, quote, you are all getting out of the car, one of the officers, while utilizing profanity, strikes the window of Mr. Smith's vehicle with an unknown instrument, shattering the window. The officer opens the door of the vehicle, and Mrs. Johnson is removed from the vehicle by the officers and is told by the second responding officer that she is under arrest. Ms. Johnston was subsequently charged with resisting arrest and obstructing government administration. She does have a prior arrest history. Her bail is set at what her family views to be excessive. Mr. Smith lodges a complaint alleging that the officers involved utilized excessive force. It is later learned that officer number 2 has previously had complaints filed against him. The disposition of these complaints is unknown. And finally, it is also learned that Mr. Smith's 12-year-old daughter recorded the entire incident with her cell phone. Cynthia Sullivan.
Very good, very good. So, on to the questions. First question on this goes to Sheriff O'Flynn. Why did the officers instruct all passengers to exit the vehicle? Is this normal for a routine traffic stop?
No, it is not. And unless the individuals are doing something criminal or inappropriate or threatening to the officer, there'd be no reason. And in fact, in our area here, we believe in containing the people in the vehicle for the safety of the officer. So that would not be something that would necessarily go on here unless there was a specific crime or issue or need. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, you'd ask the driver possibly to step out if you didn't want to embarrass that individual in front of his kids or something with a couple of questions regarding his license and that.
I see. Thank you. Next question is for Deputy Chief Fred Bell. Do the occupants of a car have a right to refuse exiting?
Do they have a right to refuse? Yes. But we try to get voluntary compliance from people. The officer should give his reasoning for wanting the person out of the car. As the sheriff said, in Rochester, we don't take people out of the car unless we are going to make a physical arrest for something, and then they know why we are asking them to leave the car. When you stop a vehicle, you're responsible for everyone's safety. They're safe in the car. You get them out of the car, you can have a traffic accident. You got a young kid there who may be rambunctious and end up getting hurt. So you're responsible for everyone's safety, and there's no legitimate reason to take these people out of the car.
Okay, thank you. Next question is for District Attorney Sandra Dorley. And I've got two for you in this instance. First, how long can a police officer detain the occupants of a vehicle during a traffic stop?
Okay, I'll do the first one first. Is this turned on? Great. Generally, the investigation into a traffic infraction is more limited than the scope of a criminal investigation. In this scenario, obviously the police had probable cause to stop the vehicle for no seatbelt passenger, but the officer may only take a reasonable amount of time to comply with the investigation of the traffic infraction. But of course, if during that time other information becomes known to the police officer, it can escalate from simply a traffic investigation into a criminal investigation, depending on observations of the officer.
Okay, great. Next, when can a police officer use physical force to effect an arrest?
Well, a police officer can use physical force. It's laid out in the criminal procedure law in conjunction with our penal law. The general rule is that physical force can be used if the police officer reasonably believes it's necessary to effectuate the arrest, prevent escape, or defend themselves or others from the defendant's use of physical force.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you. The next question is for Mayor Warren, and this question was submitted by Carrie Jensen from the University of Rochester's International Office. And the question is, Mayor Warren, what can we do to foster more input and involvement from both those that commit and those who are impacted by criminal activity to ensure more efficient processes and more appropriate sanctions? And this is involved in the principles of restorative justice.
Well, I think that these types of forums help to get people more involved and aware of what their expectations and rights are. I think that having better interactions with our law enforcement officers is also helpful, and that's the reason why we started as a city clergy on patrol, asking our clergy to get involved in walking with our police officers in the neighborhoods and going door to door and talking to residents. It's one of the reasons why we're going from a 2-section police model to a 5-section police model, so that we can start to foster those relationships with people that live in the neighborhoods. I think that making sure that we also encourage the community that that it's easier to comply and fight on the back end with civil rights issues if you believe your civil rights issues are violated, because a lot of times in the end the person that gets hurt or people get hurt when there is non-compliance. And so having these discussions with the community as well as our law enforcement officers on how they actually deal with the community, it has to be a mutual respect. It's not a either or. Both sides have to respect each other's position, and that everyone needs to know that this is a community effort. Our police officers need the community, and the community needs our police.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. Next question is for Judge Miller. If the scenario indicates that the police officer used excessive force at the scene, why is the accused held in custody?
Before I answer that question, I'd like to acknowledge some of my colleagues who are in the back of the room. They remind me of myself when maybe I was in high school.
And some Unite colleagues, yeah.
That's Judge Family Court of John Gallagher, and Justice Supreme Court Joanne Winslow, and County Court Judge Vincent D'Onofrio, and Rochester City Court Chief Clerk Eugene Cremy. They're all in the back. We can acknowledge them.
And Unite colleagues, they're part of the Unite process too. So yeah, welcome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, at the point where this case would come before a judge, it would happen at arraignment part. And at that point, all the judge would have is an accusatory instrument,
right,
and a document indicating these are the charges that are being pressed by the district attorney's office alleging whatever crime that they say occurred. At that point, the court does not determine whether or not there was excessive force used. Typically, that would come at a trial, maybe at a pre-trial hearing, but most times it would come at a trial. So bail is based upon other factors outside, which does not include an allegation of excessive force. The criminal procedure law outlines statutorily what those factors are. I won't read all of them, but they consist, some of them, of the principal's character, reputation, habits, mental condition, his employment, financial resources, his family ties to the community, his length of residence in this community, whether or not they have a criminal record, and also that would include a youthful offender adjudication will be considered, whether or not they have a previous record of attending court proceedings, whether or not that individual is charged with a family crime, and whether or not they have a history of use of a possession of a firearm, and what is the weight of evidence against that individual. Now, in regards to the allegation of excessive force, perhaps that can be utilized by the defense counsel if they have that information at the bail hearing stage to determine the strength of the case of the government. But those are some of the factors that will be utilized to make a determination of what the bail would be.
Okay, and is there ever an instance where bail is too high?
Well, certainly, in the state of New York, the excessive bail is one of the ways where if a person feels it's excessive bail, they can make an application to a higher court and to review whether or not that is the bail that was set at the arraignment part or after indictment was too high. There is a tremendous amount of discretion given to an arraigning judge in regards to bail amounts. In preparing for this, I was trying to find cases where a determination was made, and you have to look at it from a case-by-case basis. It really is extremely fact-specific. There's no formula, if you will, in regards to that, and there are a lot of factors that come into play. But I can imagine, and again, I can't say this to be absolutely true, but if someone was charged with trespassing, they had no criminal record, that's a violation punishable up to 15 days in a county jail, and the judge was set bail at $10 million, I would imagine that would be excessive. But beyond that, we really cannot give a number that's too high. It will have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next question is for Councilman Adam McFadden. Councilman McFadden, looking at some of the conflicts that have occurred between the community and criminal justice professionals, we all share a challenge in not judging others based upon our past experiences. What best practice would you recommend, or practices would you recommend that would encourage mutual respect by both?
Just given my experience in dealing with this, one element that's missing when these types of situations occur is the human aspect of it.
Okay.
That we tend not to humanize the other side. And I think about the number of calls or complaints that I've gotten over the years, that it always seems to be a them versus us. We don't look at each other as human beings. We look at each other as groups. And that makes it very difficult. And the other part of that is we tend to bring injustice swiftly, and justice never comes swiftly. And that's the problem when you have these types of interactions. When people are wronged, we're very slow about making it right, but we're quick to invoke the injustice part of that, and walking people through that leaves a very bitter experience for both sides, actually, with folks that lingers on. So it doesn't become a thing of the past. It becomes a thing of the present, and we never deal with it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Next question is for Reverend Scott. Reverend Scott, in this scenario, do you determine the citizen to be at fault in any way? And if so, in what way specifically? In this scenario, do you determine the citizen to be at fault in any way? And if so, what way specifically?
When I read that, I raised the question as to whether or not in getting stopped for not having a seatbelt on, does that become the responsibility of the driver of the car or the person who doesn't have the seatbelt on? Who would be charged? I'm not sure about the answer to that question, whether or not it's the driver of the car or the person that is not wearing a seatbelt. I think I've been under the impression that it would be the person who is driving that would get the fine. Am I right on that or no?
I'm sorry, we're having to do
Well, in that in part, but also in looking at how the situation escalated.
Yeah, well,
if you could talk about that too.
That would hinge on the answer to that question would hinge on
The mic's not
right here. Yeah. Okay, I'm new at this.
All right, that's all right. Okay. That's all right. We're all family. Go ahead, sir.
These technical things. I guess I looked at that and I was just wondering whether or not the person that was not wearing a seatbelt would be liable. And if that is the case, then the person could have been asked to get out of the car. But if that is not the case, and the driver is in fact the person who is liable, if in fact he has a person in his car not wearing a seatbelt, then I don't see why, since that driver had already presented his information in terms of what was requested of him to produce his license and registration. Right. He had already done that. Now, if this person in his car was not wearing a seatbelt, then in my estimation, they should have just issued a ticket and let that be the end of it.
Well, on that note, now I go over to our public defender, Tim Donaher. Actually, your timing was perfect because I had him next to ask this question. Why not simply ticket the passenger and let them leave?
I think that's an excellent question to be asked of the officers involved. That's a very good question. I think that a large part of the frustration that exists even in our hypothetical community, but maybe also in our community, is there's oftentimes a perception that the application of the laws are inconsistent, unfair, that the law might be applied to a certain segment of the community and it's not being applied to other segments of the community. For instance, when we were meeting to discuss how we were going to proceed as a committee, as a justice committee, we had a very fruitful discussion. Judge Miller, myself, and several other people were there about the application of, for instance, locally, the violation for no bell on your bike, which might happen in the city of Rochester, but doesn't happen in the suburbs. And it's that type of application of the law in one area of our community, but not another, which leads to frustration. And I was saying to Commander Phelps earlier this evening, law enforcement, particularly RPD, I think, is under a lot of pressure to reduce crime. And as a result, they use what are lawful means to do so, but might be classified as aggressive police tactics. And when the community in the city see those aggressive police tactics being used in the city, but they don't see those same tactics being used in, for instance, Pittsford, it can lead to a large amount of frustration. And then they legitimately ask questions. Why is that? Why is there a disparate treatment between how we're being treated in the city, certain areas of the city of Rochester, and how people in the suburbs are being treated by their police agencies? And they're very well, I'm no expert in policing, and there very well might be legitimate reasons. They're lawful police practices, but because there's no discourse between, well, there might be, I don't mean to put words in people's mouth, but there needs to be better education, I think, between our police agencies and the community to say, these are lawful, perhaps lawful means for us to achieve the goal we all want, which is reduced crime.
Right.
And it's not because of racial animus. It's not because of we're trying to single out poor people. It's because in high crime areas, aggressive police tactics are needed to achieve that result. And I said, I'm not trying to pass judgment on whether those police tactics are appropriate. I will say that in a lot of the time they are very lawful. But it does lead to that perception of we're being treated unfairly because they're not employing those same tactics in other areas of our community. So when you see what happened in our hypothetical and they don't get the traffic ticket that probably I would just get, that raises valid questions amongst community members.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Next question is for Mayor Warren. When an incident of this nature is brought to your attention by a constituent or someone that might have specifically was involved, what action do you take to address it as mayor?
I call the chief.
I almost got rid of that question for that purpose, but I said, I'll let her. You got to elaborate a little bit.
So I sit down and talk to the chief, who in turn does an internal investigation. And sometimes if the victims or the victim families are wanting to talk to me, I sit down and talk to them, and I try not to pass judgment on the situation until all the facts are reviewed and given, and then we'll talk about the consequences from there.
Okay, thank you. This next question I direct at Director Davis, because it's more of a holistic approach to policing in general, and may not necessarily reflect some of the strategies in Rochester, but it was submitted by, and I'm going to try and pronounce the name right, Bulent Ozdemir. Is that right, Dave? Yeah. Dave coached me on how to pronounce it, but I might have butchered it a little bit. But he's from the Turkish Community Center. And the question he submitted is, what's being done to inform and educate newcomers, immigrants, to the United States about how to deal with encounters with the police, and how are officers trained on issues of ethnic and religious diversity?
So I'm actually going to probably end up giving that one back to the chief. But before we get to that one, I want to, if I may, go back
to... Please go ahead.
Yeah, to a comment that was just made about the crime strategies at a more general level. So I shared with the group at lunch, and I think what the chief public defender was talking about is this issue what we call procedural justice or legitimacy. Right. And when we look at this, what that means is people, something may be legal, but it may be perceived to be illegitimate. So I have the right to do it, but that doesn't mean that I should do it. And quite often, where we're asking police departments to train officers is not to always say, can I do this? Mm-hmm. Does the law allow me to do this versus should I do this because of the outcome that I know it's going to have in our community? And so when you look at crime strategies, if you look at things that if they have a negative result, it will be counter to public safety. And in the end, it's the public trust that will be the strongest piece of public safety. And so I share with agencies and communities around the country that, if you look at the issue of public safety, one of the things that communities I would recommend they do is look at redefining what public safety means. In other words, public safety cannot be simply the absence of crime. It must be the presence of justice as well, so that you're not compromising between safe streets and civil liberties. In fact, the best way to get to the safe streets is by having constitutional-based practices. And so if people do believe that it's despair, it will go to their compliance. I think you're 100% right. If people think that it's unfairly, even if it's perception, it will go to their compliance. And I would share with just a person to think about it. If you get stopped by an officer and you think the officer stopped you because of who you are, because of where you live, because of who you are, the officer is rude, even if you don't get the ticket, you're still very upset. Mm-hmm. If you're stopped and you believe you got stopped because the officer truly believe that you should be stopped, he or she was respectful to you, even with the ticket, you're still more likely to say that that was a positive encounter and respect the professionalism of the officer that made the stop. So we know that goes to this idea of procedural justice. People comply because they believe the law is applied fairly. So I think that was 100% right. With regards to the issue of the immigrant communities, and the reason why I'm going to defer that is I don't know of nationally there's something that we do when people are visiting the country, become to the country, or become naturalized. And I would say that as we look at our communities, because of the diversity of them, that really becomes a community policing mandate. That you got communities, and many, and I'm sure Rochester's not different, 50, 60 to 100 different languages spoke within a community. Right. And so really the question would be is how do you have cultural competency? How do you have your officers engage the community so that people can understand what the role of the police are, understanding that the role may be different in the country that they came from? Right. How do you still garner that same trust that we're talking about? And how do you ensure that everyone has a voice at the table? And because of that, sometimes it's hard because we use the word citizen, which suggests that there's certain rights applied policing-wise that a non-citizen or a person that has not yet received citizenship. Mm-hmm. So the idea of a community member is going to be very diverse. It may include immigrant populations. It may include a whole host of people who speak different languages. But the challenge of governance is to make sure that you have outreach, that you are making it easy for people to achieve the services, to understand that they have a voice at the table, and that they're going to be respected. So I think that's more of a local challenge quite frankly, the national challenge because
Makes sense.
people live in communities, not in federal bureaucracies.
No, you actually confirmed a major point on this, that it's less about specifying it towards certain immigrant populations, but more about measuring your cultural competence. And I think that's something we can all kind of wrap our hands around. So thank you. Next question is for Deputy Chief Bell. Are there rules within the police department around the officers' use of profanity in dealing with the public?
Yes, we have rules of conduct in the Rochester Police Department.
Okay.
And in any interaction with any member of the community, you must treat them with respect, you must be civil, and you must be polite.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is for Sheriff O'Flynn. How do you investigate an officer's use of force? And there are actually two questions here, Sheriff. How do you investigate an officer's use of force? And what do you do to monitor officers that have had complaints against them for utilizing excessive force?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question. No, actually, we have our command officers, lieutenants or above, respond to the scene of any time there's a use of force by a deputy or sergeant. And they'll conduct a complete investigation, interview the individuals at the scene, get everybody's story, any evidence that they may be able to develop at the scene. Mm-hmm. And then those are, depending on the nature of it, if it can't be handled at that level as far as determining the force appropriate or not, depending on the level of the force, it may be referred to our internal affairs section, which would then launch a full investigation into it. But many times it's determined right off the bat that the force was appropriate and within the guidelines of the sheriff's office. The other question again?
It was about monitoring. How do you monitor personnel that might have some indicators that are...
We have regular reviews of employees' performance for their evaluations on a 90-day basis. And we also have an early warning system put in place in our office where individuals' conduct, they may get citizen complaints. There may be excessive sick time or inappropriate behavior in other areas in which will trigger a concern, and then their performance will be reviewed and appropriate action will be taken either from a clinical perspective or from a performance perspective.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is for Councilman Adam McFadden. What are the most common issues you are called upon to address?
As it relates to this issue, a lot of it deals with complaints either about excessive force or courtesy. They're about neck and neck, where there seems to be an officer who might have cursed or was disrespectful in language. At least the person took it that way.
Okay.
And then thirdly, the over-application of some of the laws, which I refer to as the black tax. I'm just going to put it out there. When we do things like the bicycle bell, we had the year where we had a 1,000% increase in arrests in schools, kids being arrested for inciting riots, for food fights in the cafeteria, being late to class, that kind of thing. Those types of things do not happen in other places in our region but the city. So I get those types of calls, and when I get those types of calls, we typically go through a screening process to find out what initiated the contact in the first place.
Okay.
To try to figure out, was there just cause even for the police contact? And once we figure that out, we take the appropriate action by letting the person know what rights they have in terms of filing a complaint, or if they might want to think about not filing a complaint because it might not have been justified what they're complaint was about.
I see. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next question is for Reverend Scott. Reverend Scott, what factors do you believe may contribute to the tension that exists between some law enforcement and some members of the community?
Well, I think it's historical. And to get off script just a little bit, I'm thinking as you asked that question and as I read it about a situation that occurred with me. When I was coming home from a meeting one night, and a friend of mine had driven me, and my driveway was full of snow, so I couldn't get up. He couldn't get up the driveway in his car, and I said, look, man, just park here, and I'll walk up. And just as I was getting ready to get out of the car, a cop car came up and blocked his side, and another one came up and blocked the front of the car. And that was okay. But then when I got out of the car, the first policeman that got out on his side said, "What are you guys doing around here?" Now, I live in Penfield. And and I'm still the only African-American on the street. And his response was, "What are you guys doing around here?" And needless to say, he didn't get a good response from me because of what he said and the way he said it. Right. Like I had no right to be around there. And I'm standing in front of my house. And so when you add up those kinds of things historically, then the question becomes not so much what should I do and how should I handle that, but what should he do in approaching people that way? Right. What will happen to change his attitude, which will directly affect mine? And so I think we have to look at those kinds of things and look at, and talking with Dave, there's a need, therefore, for training, for sensitivity and understanding in terms of how to approach people. That was a rookie mistake, whether the police officer was rookie or not. That was a rookie mistake. And so I think that when I look at the question, we have to begin to look at the history that has taken place between the two people. And how does that change? Well, there's a kind of a quasi-theological quote that says, if you want to know what God is going to do, all you have to do is take a look at what he's already done. And I think the same thing is true with people. If you want to know how they'll behave, all you have to look at is the history of how they have behaved. And you'll get more of the same. You can expect more of the same. We can change that, though, with right training, with, like the mayor has said, putting people back on the streets, putting the police officers back on the street to communicate with people and not just ride by in police cars.
Right.
I was at the House of Mercy one evening, and the police officers came riding through the neighborhood, and they were playing the theme from Cops, bad boys, what you going to do? What you going to do when we come for you? I mean, that was inciting.
I see.
So I think those kinds of things have to stop, and there needs to be some training involved.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Scott. Appreciate that. Next question is for Judge Miller. And I just want to point out that when you acknowledged the VIPs in the audience, there was one you forgot, right? Mrs. Miller?
Oh.
Ah?
Oh. My beautiful bride is in the audience. Raise your hand. There she go.
No, he really has been a joy to have on the committee. And if I could point out for a minute, for Unite Justice, we had 3 priorities: to educate the community, to listen, and that's what the forum was about. And then our next piece is really based on employment. And our first initiative, which was to educate the community, we did a court academy. Very well received. We had a full house. I had to turn people away. And Judge Miller, he went over very well in that. And I say that sincerely because he gave a few excellent examples. The one about if you don't mind repeating it for this group, but one about the kid and the cookie and the cookie crumbs. Yes. Yeah, I think it really sent home the message that everybody could grasp about understanding the foundation of the criminal justice process. So,
you like to share that little?
I would like for you to share it. Yeah, I mean, for some reason too, the evaluations we got, they just said keep Judge Miller, keep him involved in the process. So I'm just trying to live up to that, sir.
At that point of the discussion, we were talking about the criminal justice system, and there was some confusion in regards to how can an attorney, a defense attorney, encourage their client to plead guilty to a charge when that client is indicating they didn't commit the charge. And there was some wide discussions on that, some amazement, some bemusement in terms of why that would happen. So I took that opportunity to share my view of the criminal justice system. It's a matter of not whether you did it or not. A lot of people, that's a hard concept to understand. We're there to understand what does the evidence show. And if you pay attention to any real trials in the opening statement, the prosecutors are trained to say the evidence will show. They're not trained to say this person did thus and so. So I took that to say, for instance, let's say there was two young men sleeping in the same room. Both were given an instruction by their mother, you cannot go into the cookie jar. You're done, no more cookies for the night. One is on the top bunk, the older, the younger is on the bottom bunk. They're both in the room, they're asleep. The older one decides to get up, go into the kitchen, sneak a couple of cookies, eats them, gathers some crumbs, sprinkles them on the little brother's face, and goes to bed. The next morning, the mother comes in to wake them up. She noticed that there were cookies missing, and then she sees on the mouth of the younger cookie crumbs on his mouth and in the bed. Well, did the younger one eat the cookies? No. Well, what does the evidence show? And a lot of times, that person will be found guilty because the evidence is pretty plain in the eyes of the mother. And so we're not there when crimes happen. When I say we, the prosecutor's not there, the defense attorney's not there, and the judge is not there. But what is there is brought in the courtroom is the evidence. And so that was an understanding that I tried to convey in regards to how the criminal justice system works. It's about the evidence, not about whether you actually did it or not. We hope that the evidence will match up to the actions. And sometimes, frankly, it does not. We've found a number of cases where new evidence has come forward, DNA evidence, or there's been a recantation regarding eyewitness testimony that would indicate that this person perhaps did not commit that crime. But at the time of the court proceedings, it's what the evidence that was put forward that rendered a verdict of guilt by the triers of facts.
Thank you. Thanks for repeating that. I appreciate it. But that example went over really well for our group. I've been involved in the process for years, and I loved hearing about it because it just gets to the point. And I remember my sister setting me up for stuff when we were kids. and I said, you know what? Okay, yeah, I can relate to that. Next question is for District Attorney Sandra Dorley. I know we talked a little bit about the safety from the law enforcement perspective about removing people from a vehicle during the traffic stop. But can you talk a little bit about the legality of that?
Sure. And actually, let me go off script if you don't mind for 2 seconds.
That's okay.
I just want to point out something that Director Davis said about the procedural justice aspect.
Yes.
And if that's anything that we all could take away from this this forum, it would be remarkable. It's the legitimacy of the procedure, not necessarily what the end result is, but if the procedure is legitimate
Right.
and fair and transparent, if the relationship between the police and the person being arrested is fair, open, respectful, then we're not worried so much about the outcome. We're worried about the process and the respect. And I've done a lot of research on the procedural justice method, and it really is something that we really need to bring to Rochester. And I know that the Division of Criminal Justice Services, Jeff Clark will give you a shout out there in the audience. It's something that they're teaching us as an element of our GIVE grant, which is one of the grants that we use to fund positions. So it really is important. And if you all go back and Google procedural justice, Tracy Mears, I mean, it's a fabulous concept. And if we could bring that to Rochester, I think we're going to see a marked improvement.
I believe the director, Davis, also mentioned it at lunch
Yeah.
earlier. We talked a little bit about that. So I may,
So
I may have him weigh in on it after you respond.
So I apologize for going off script, but I really
It's quite
just
all
wanted
right.
to jump in on that. Can a police officer order the occupants of a vehicle out of the car? And here we have, passengers and we have the driver. Yes, under the law, an officer may ask passengers and driver to step out. It's really based upon officer safety. And conversely, a police officer can order the passenger and the driver to stay in the car for officer safety. It's all a determination by the officer. It's what he encounters when he walks up to the vehicle. I looked at this scenario, and in this case, it probably the situation escalated when the passenger is not able to give identification, and she reaches down to her purse. That's called a furtive movement, a furtive motion in legalese, and it will escalate in the officer's mind the situation because they don't know what the woman is reaching for. Does she have a gun? In this case, she was probably simply reaching for some identification to show that she didn't have a license because. But it escalates the situation. In that case, obviously they were still in the car. But getting back to the basic answer, the law says it's really a matter of officer safety. Yes, if the officers feel for the situation that they want the occupants to be removed, they can. If they want them to remain in the vehicle, they can as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Director, do you want to talk a little bit about
Well, the procedure, I think she gave a great summary, better than mine, of the procedural justice. And I would, Tracy Mears, also Tom Tyler, both out of Yale. It is something to take a look at, and I think especially for police officers to understand, it explains a lot. The other area that we are recommending strongly, and it goes to actually the answer with the officer's safety and a lot of the questions of any scenario, is what we call fair and impartial policing. And we're learning more and more about the science of implicit bias and how that affects the decision-making process that all of us make. And so too often when we talk about disparate outcomes, you heard even during my speech talking about the disparities in incarceration rates, things of that nature. And I said disparate versus discriminatory. Now, when you have implicit bias, that's a human behavior that we all have. We all have stereotypes and biases that we're not even aware of. That can result in discriminatory outcomes without the intent. And so at some point we have to really start, but this is manageable. People can be trained about it. They can reduce it. Why this is important, if you look at a lot of the scenarios where you have what some people would deem to be over-policing or overly aggressive strategies, is based on the stereotype of the people that they're policing. If you fear young men of color, subconsciously or otherwise, then reaching for your wallet has a different meaning. That becomes furtive versus reaching for the wallet.
I see.
If you think young men of color are more likely to sell drugs, then the stop becomes not just because this is the legitimacy, not just because you ran a red light. It's exploratory because I think you have drugs in there. So I have to have a series of questions now that tell you I think that. What are you on probation for? Have you been arrested? Things that by the nature of the questioning suggest criminality or attaches it to you immediately. So to the extent we get the mindset of that we deal with our biases so that we're not stereotyping any group and not making, we're looking at their behaviors. They used to have a phrase, if you recall, I had it when I was a Noble years ago about racial profiling. This is when you use race as a descriptor, not a predictor. So race is appropriate to describe what someone looks like, right? So if you're looking for an armed robbery suspect that is 6 foot, handsome and buff, that I should expect to be stopped every once in a while. I'll see who's catching that. But simply because a person that's African American did a robbery, you cannot then say that predict future criminal behavior, that all young men that fit my description now are criminals, and you stop them. But all this ties into the science of implicit bias. So when you put that on top of the procedural justice, then what ends up happening, and this is why this is critical, is because the officers, when you talk about it in race terms, that means you're accusing them of being racist. And the discussion is a very short discussion. It's a wrong discussion. I still stand by that the overwhelming majority of men and women that serve this profession are honorable, they're noble, that it's a tough job policing a democratic society. They should be honored for their service, but they still suffer from implicit bias just like you and I. Right. And to have that discussion, to manage it, to let them learn how procedural justice affects people's compliance with the law comes up with a much better outcome. And so these are the kind of the steps I think as you move forward I would take a look at with regards to policing.
Excellent, thank you. I want to ask, go back to Sheriff O'Flynn and ask a question around the use of a weapon. And can you, in the case of this scenario, talk a little bit about why, in this case, the officer drew their weapon? I know we Sandra Dorley mentioned about the furtive movement, and we talked a little bit about that, but if you could kind of elaborate on that, what that means as a tactics process.
Oh, absolutely. We have allow the officers quite a bit of discretion when it comes to when they draw their weapon.
Right.
Now, if they feel a safety reason or there's suspicious activity going on or whatever the case may be, they may draw the weapon out and have it at the ready. However, once they acquire a target, they better be prepared to use it to address deadly physical force. Right. So we wouldn't expect them to be pointing it at people and such, but having it ready if they feel that there's a danger, or in this case, the person made a movement that they felt was a concern to them. Beyond that, they better be justified and be ready to explain their activities for why they pointed it at an individual.
Understood. Thank you.
Cynthia, can I follow up a little bit on that?
Well, yeah, I actually had you slotted next, so now you. But really, the flow's been there. Go for it.
It might be surprising to people to hear, and certainly Sandra set forth a lot of the factors that a court will use in determining whether or not a stop is justified. And certainly those same factors are used whenever there's an analysis of the appropriateness of a police officer drawing his firearm. Again, because once you draw your firearm, that's usually indicative of an arrest, and so we look into was there constitutional justification. But one factor that the Supreme Court has said is an appropriate factor to take into account, and this might shock some people, is whether or not you're in a high crime area, which means the Supreme Court has actually said where the police-citizen encounter occurs is a relevant factor. If there's a lot of crime in that location, that might be a factor that the police officer could rely on to engage in an arrest or a stop. And that might be perplexing to people when they're hearing that, saying, what should it matter, the location of where this occurs? But it is. It's a constitutional justification for when a police officer might pull a person over or engage in arrest or draw their firearm because they're in a high crime area. And that might get back to Director Davis is saying, well, although it might be a legal justification, maybe a community might say we really don't think that should come into play. But it's certainly appropriate constitutionally for the officer to say, I was in a high crime area, there was furtive movements, and we should, as a community, I think we all agree, officer safety should come first. So that's something that when I explain to people often that high crime area is a factor, they're often perplexed by that.
That's a good point to make. Thank you.
Are we going to be able to respond to any of these things?
You can certainly respond. No, Reverend Scott. We were in looking at the group we've had. I wanted people that were provocative and who would certainly, speak their mind on certain things. So he's always done it in a respectful way. But sir, if you would please weigh in.
Oh, I thought you said please wait.
No. No, sir. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in a situation like that, as an example, using that same scenario, a person is walking down the street
Right.
as I was at one point, and got stopped in a high crime area. So, and the policeman stopped me
Right.
when I caught him doing something wrong. I won't go into what it was, but I caught him doing, but it was in a high crime area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm an innocent person. I'm studying for the ministry at that particular time. It's okay for him to stop me because he's in a high crime area and maybe even pull a gun on me. I mean, I have some problems with that, and I'm sure that the community would as well. So what can be done about that? How should that be handled? I mean, should we just acquiesce or what? I'm confused.
Well, that's what often leads to such frustration amongst our client base, where if we try to explain that may be a relevant factor in their encounter with a police officer, either leading to their arrest or the drawing of the firearm, and they say, well, that's not fair, and I say, I agree with you. I'm not sure you're just because you were in a location that is classified as a high crime area that your constitutional rights are different from another person who's not in a high crime area doesn't seem to me to be fair, which again raises those questions of perception and procedural justice where the law should apply equally everywhere. In fact, we had a case recently, well, it wasn't maybe 10 years ago, I can't say that's recent anymore, where our client was stopped running through a high crime area in the evening hours wearing a tracksuit, and he was jogging. And the high crime area was used as a justification for the stop, because if you were obviously jogging through a low crime area, he probably wouldn't have been stopped. So I see that as being although it's legal, it's something that often gives rise to frustration because it seems unfair.
All right, Sheriff, you want to weigh in?
Just real quickly, I would encourage anyone that is frustrated like that to call the police department, call the agency that the police officers work for, and have it investigated. That's what we have an internal affairs section for, is to make sure that people who are frustrated and feel they've been wronged, that they have a venue to take that complaint to, so it can be thoroughly looked into. It may, in the end, you'll be just as frustrated as you were afterwards, but there may be that these people, inappropriately acted, and just because it's a high crime area doesn't mean that you can't live a normal life.
Well, then can I go back to the question that I raised before about my situation?
Please do, and then Director Davis, you can weigh in after that. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
In the situation that I talked about where the police officer stopped me when I was getting ready to go into my house and said, what are you guys doing around here? What's my redress there? And what would happen?
Oh, just the same, because, look, I'm elected, and I want everyone, after they've had an encounter with our deputy, to feel satisfied with that encounter and feel as though they've been treated fairly with respect. Our core values are respect, integrity, teamwork, and excellence. So we would expect that every person, even if you receive a ticket or are arrested, that you were dealt with in a very fair way. So if you felt that the person's actions were inappropriate, that their demeanor wasn't appropriate, that they asked questions in a way that it offended you, I would love to know that, so then we can train people to be more sensitive or whatever the case may be.
All right, now I want to let Director Davis weigh in. Right. Did you want to say something to Mayor? Okay, Director.
So, I mean, not to get into the legal part, I think it's a little bit more than just the crime area. I mean, it's got to be a couple more factors than just I'm in a crime area. But here's where, when you start looking at nationally, you're looking at best practices. And it was mentioned, I did a lot of work on consent decrees of agencies that run their investigation and pattern practice, is why data collection is important. Right. And why I would strongly recommend police departments consider collecting it. At some point, the kind of stuff that you would track for data collection is exactly this. If you're doing a lot of searches, what is the outcome of the search? If you're doing a lot of stops, what is the outcome of the stops? If you're doing a lot of stops and you have complaints, then what is the return on the investment for that police activity? This is the challenge that many have had and why there's such a debate on stop, question, and frisk. It goes back to the earlier question of can I versus should I? And even and here's where this also comes in. We're focusing on a high crime area. It goes broader than that, right? As being a cop for 28 years, there's a theme that we used to have which is you give me a vehicle and a vehicle code in 10 seconds, and I will find a legal reason to stop you, right? It could be 25 and a 20. It could be bald tires, crack. It could be pretty much anything. Vehicle codes in most states are very onerous documents. And so the legality of it is why that's insufficient. You always want it to be legal. But if you look at racial profiling challenges, in many cases, they're not going to be Fourth Amendment challenges, which is the search and seizure of the stop. They're going to be 14th Amendment, which is the due process for an entire group of people because of the disparate outcomes.
I see.
And so when you collect data, then you can start measuring a department's effectiveness, efficiencies, and its outcomes, which means if you have a lot of these stops where people are in a high crime area, a lot of searches in which nothing's being produced, then as the chief executive, you have to ask yourself, what is the return on the investment? Bad people are not going to jail. It's not affecting the crime rate. And the people I need the most to fight the crime are now very upset with me because I've alienated them because they become disenfranchised. So this is one where this is why procedural justice is so important, is legality versus legitimacy. And you have to push policing towards being legitimate in the eyes of the people that they're supposed to be engaging with.
Excellent, thank you. Mayor, if you'll weigh in, and then Adam, if you want to follow.
I just wanted to say that the issue becomes that the public really doesn't know the outcome. When they feel violated and when they feel like an officer has violated their rights, a lot of times when they do complain, it takes a long period of time and they never really understand or know the outcome. They don't know this officer's history. They don't know if this has happened to other people. And we may, as elected officials or whomever, say, you know, we're sorry that this happened to you and apologize. But a lot of times that's not enough. It's not enough to the person that feels like their rights have been violated or they've been treated in a negative sort of way. And I think that that sort of is, you know, goes to what Reverend Scott is talking about when it comes down to, okay, well, so what is my recourse? So I call you and you tell me sorry and you give the officer, maybe you train him, maybe you don't, but I still don't know if that happened or not.
I see. Okay, Adam, please.
But the other part of that is how many times does that interaction lead to charges? Because what I find is when people are stopped the way that the Reverend was stopped, that when they begin to ask why, that those charges, well, there seems to be charges pressed after that in a retaliatory nature. So people get arrested for resisting arrest, obstruction of governmental process, misconduct, that kind of thing. And I look at those, when I get complaints to my office, when I see those three things, those are signs to me that something was wrong. Okay. Because typically when people are arrested for a crime, that crime is spelled out clearly. It's not one of these interaction crimes. And so for us, we never go back and correct that, even when it makes its way to the judge. Typically, it might get ACD'd, or the person has to end up copping out to some type of misdemeanor charge. And for me, that does a bigger injustice to the community in the process, because people remember that. And it was because they asked why that started this whole confrontation. Because people felt like they had the right to ask why, and they're penalized for asking why or how they ask why.
And that gets back to the historical piece that I was talking about earlier.
Okay, and hold that thought, Reverend, because what I want to do is ask Judge Miller on that note. Yeah. How do you handle allegations of abuse of power in a resisting arrest case? When that gets to you and you see those details, is there a point where that might be brought to your attention? And if so, how do you handle it? Does it impact how you handle your case as far as charges?
Well, I'm going to say this. The most powerful person in the courtroom is the prosecutor. So I'm just a referee.
She's like,
I just call the rules of the game. And I don't make a determination. I make a determination of the process is fair in regarding the allegations before the court. I don't make a determination unless there's a bench trial, and I am then called upon to be the trier of fact of what happened outside the courtroom. So during those stages where these allegations are raised, I can just simply understand that those are allegations. But ultimately, unless there's a trial to be had and the government has their burden to meet beyond a reasonable doubt whether or not those charges that they're bringing before the court have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, then I come and make that determination. But it's only at that part of the case. At a preliminary stage, if there's allegations made, they're just allegations that I'm aware of, but at that juncture, I cannot, stop the prosecution, if you will, or direct the prosecution to take a stance. I can advise, perhaps, with both parties and say, hey, you may want to look at this, or may want to take this back to your superiors, and I'm directing that conversation to the assistant district attorney in the courtroom. But ultimately, the prosecutor has to determine the strength of his or her case. And if their evidence suggests that somehow the actions on part of one of their witnesses, which in this case would be the police officer, is tainted by misconduct of that particular officer, they will have to weigh that in going forward with the case. Did I frame that properly?
Yes. Sandra, you want to weigh in?
Exactly, and that's what we do. When we look at a case, we look at the conduct. If a case comes before us and we see resisting arrest, OGA, obstructing governmental administration, you know what? We get it. We take a look at it. We look at the conduct of the police officer. We look at the conduct of the defendant. And, we make a judgment based on the facts as we have it, and we try to do what's just. A lot of the times they are ACD'd and adjourned in contemplation of dismissal. But, there are times when if we see that someone has a pattern of doing this, every time, that they have a police encounter, it escalates, there's no respect, then we look at it a little differently. But we really do look at the facts of every particular case, the nature of the defendant, and try to do what's right in every case.
Can you explain ACD just quickly for the
An ACD,
folks
an
watching?
adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, which means if you stay out of trouble for the next 6 months, the case will be dismissed and your record of arrest will be sealed. So it's as if it didn't happen. But it gives us a 6-month window to make sure that you're not a habitual person who's out there harassing other people in the neighborhood or harassing the police. We just want to make sure that we're doing the right thing.
Okay, Sheriff, you wanted to weigh in?
I'd like to just weigh in on Reverend Scott's situation, if I can, just one last time, because of the frustration, and I can understand where he'd be coming from. But what we also do at the Sheriff's Office, and I know the City Police does the same thing, we also bring in an outside independent group of citizens to review complaints like those that are received.
That's a good point to bring
to
up.
make
Thank
sure
you.
that the investigation was done thoroughly and fairly. And then we always do get back to the citizen and say that either the case was determined to be founded or unfounded, and then if it was founded, that appropriate action would be taken.
Sure, most of the time, most of my career I lived in the city, and I can assure you, in my dealings with, at that particular time, the Rochester Police Department, that was not the case. And as the mayor has said, one of the frustrations, the biggest frustration that we had at that particular time was that we weren't getting answers. I recall bringing a young boy coming to my house with his mother, and his eye was swollen, and I'm not lying to you. It was as big as a golf ball, 14 years old. We took that boy downtown the next day along with his mother. We filed the complaint. Never got an answer as to what was going to happen to the officers that did that. What we did get was that they said, well, there were 2 officers there, Minister Scott, and we know that something happened. We know one of them did it. We just don't know which one. And that was it. So, again, back to the question that you raised with me. With that kind of history, it's difficult to build trust.
No, that's understood.
And it's difficult to change that. In interacting with people, as Dave was saying earlier, in interacting with people one-on-one, I don't want to be a bad guy. I really don't.
I understand.
And I don't want to hate anybody. I don't.
Right.
And I don't hate anybody. I find that working one-on-one with people like Dave, then I think some of these things can get changed.
Right. I would agree with that, and I would also, so for example, Deputy Chief Bell is here, and when I worked with him, he was a captain, and we talk about these different personalities and who you can trust, and I remember working with him in that if you'd have brought something like that to his attention, you could certainly count on the fact that it would have been addressed. And then even in the culture of law enforcement, I mean, we would have this saying, and I think the deputy chief can relate to it, is that you had certain managers, supervisors that you always told the truth to because you knew they were going to be fair. And I would keep hearing that word from the director when we talk about that, is that when you think someone's going to treat you fairly, you can kind of take your lumps. You're wrong, and you can own up to that, and you know that person's not going to go overboard one way or the other. So I think that on that note, I'm certainly just really ecstatic in how everything's worked out with this. I thought we had a very thought-provoking discussion on this. Certainly, there are going to be some follow-ups on this. Well, I had Jim Lawrence telling me we came into this not sure where this was going to go, and when I say that, I mean our Unite group, thinking that this was going to be it. And I mean, we were only sort of halfway through the process, and Jim Lawrence is tugging at my arm saying, no, we got to do this again. This has to continue. And I would have to agree that based on the feedback we've gotten from the public, that they're real hungry for these types of discussions, and for us to come to a deeper understanding about some of the things that go on. And I know that, like, for example, this past Monday, Hank Rubin, who I think, Hank's with the Rochester Area Community Foundation, and they've started a discussion around the prison-to-pipeline issue involving, Adam, you talked a little bit about, a lot of arrests within the school system for different reasons, but looking at a way to come up with a new code of conduct process to try to change that. And I think, we've got a lot of citing things going on as far as us taking the lead in addressing those. So, Director Davis, what I'd like to do is, do you want to weigh in for a couple moments before we wrap up and close out?
I would just say that, one, congratulations on a great discussion. And these discussions are starting to occur, and they're occurring all over the country, and they're very much needed. I would make one recommendation. I'm not familiar with the structure of police unions in the state, but one voice that's missing is that. If you're going to bring stakeholders to the table, I'm sure you're going to respond to it, but I'm just...
Yeah, I was going to say, in fairness to the union, I called and invited them.
Right.
But I guess they have an election going on tonight, so that's why they're not here.
And it's not so much against them. I'm actually, in this case, speaking for them.
Right.
Because a lot of the questions that you're asking about or get into the disciplinary processes,
right,
certain rights that officers may have to due process and privacy and all the other things. And I think that makes it a very good discussion because there's always an equal side of that equation. I would say that, as you tackle, and I'm not going to say struggle because obviously this community is not struggling, as you tackle the issues that are facing you and facing many other communities, know there's a lot of resources out there. So, for example, there's a lot of research and a lot of best practices for how to reduce the school-to-prison pipeline. We fund a lot of school resource officers, and we now have model MOUs, memorandums of understandings between the police department and the school district to ensure that the officers are not part of the discipline process, that we do not criminalize willful defiance or youthful exuberance. That should not be a crime in this country. Kids are going to be kids. They develop in different ways, and we should not be criminalizing their behaviors. But we have best practices on that. We have knowledge products that talk about crime strategies that can build communities, whether this ceasefire, whether drug market initiatives. We have ways, we have a lot of stuff out there. We do convenings where we bring in chiefs and researchers, community leaders to work through issues. Most recently we did one in New York in April with Reverend Sharpton and about 50 police chiefs and a few others, and a mayor, police chief in New York, to talk about the impact of stop, question, and frisk and how to build a community that's damaged by that. And there's a publication just came out a couple weeks ago that summarized that discussion. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot that you can learn, and then quite frankly, as I'm sitting here, there's a lot that the industry can learn from you. And so I would hope, and I know the mayor will do this under her leadership, that we continue the relationship, that you guys will apply for COPS grants, especially our Community Policing Development Grant, where we're looking for innovative ideas and ways to support organizations and communities that are working together. Because when you do it right here, I get to be able to lift that up, support it, and point it to the other cities and agencies of way to go. But someone's got to do the heavy burden and lifting. So this is a very great opportunity. I really appreciate the invitation. It has been a learning experience, and I've talked to a lot of communities. But every time I go to a community, I learn more, and I think that's the key. And I would say I plan on sharing that. So thank you for your leadership as a community. Thank you for your leadership, especially for the law enforcement, public safety professionals, for sitting here. I would just say this, and I told them this at lunchtime. I'm losing track of time because I'm just at my schedules. Thursday evening, I think this is your first day of snow. For me, it's cold outside. For me, it's cold outside, okay? Because I'm originally from California.
Oh, that's right. You're from California.
And I am being a former police chief.
Still summer to us.
Right. I know people's schedules are busy, but I'm sitting here looking at a fire chief sitting in the audience for the last 2 hours, a police chief, a sheriff, a district attorney, a public defender, community people sitting here showing up and committing that. For people that have schedules, that means probably tomorrow morning they got to get up at 6 o'clock again. Yep. To do the work again, exactly. And that says a lot. So I want to definitely acknowledge that that's the kind of leadership that makes a difference. And as a community, you should embrace that and come to the table to make sure that you use that to advance the agenda that you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Reverend, we're actually at 7:58. Can you do it in like 10 seconds? Do you promise me? All right. Okay.
Sorry. Succinctly, I think one of the things that we can do to turn situations around is what the mayor has already proposed. And by way of clergy working together with police officers, get them back into the street where they can interact with people on a one-on-one basis and see each other as human beings and equals.
All right, thank you. Now, I would agree with that, and one point I want to stress that to the mayor that he has not complained. He loves his job, but I got to tell you, Chief Schreiber he's the big brother I never had. Anytime we needed anything, he's been there for us, and the rest of the committee can attest to that. And if I were a mayor looking for somebody, I'd steal him from you. So you want to make him happy, but
you can't have him.
No, really, I mean that sincerely. When I spoke earlier, I think I've had the best committee in the world. I'm blessed. Like I said, these were all department heads, but I couldn't tell that in the room. Everybody's willing to roll up their sleeves. They work real hard. You know, I'd have Sandra Dorley calling me at 10 o'clock at night. Did you think of this? Do you have that? You know, what do you need? Oh, I should warn you that when my husband would get a little testy on me because I was taking up a lot of time with this, I told him how well you played golf. And I was going to have you, beat him on the golf course. So you got to kind of back me up on that. But certainly to the committee, I want to thank you for your hard work and your efforts. I want to thank Director Davis for not just coming but participating, giving us your feedback. And your encouragement really means a lot to us. We'll certainly be in touch with you because there's some of the reports you've written, sort of like the bias-based policing. I would encourage you, if you haven't done so, to read that. So until our next forum next year, we already decided we're going to do another one. And also, I want to thank our audience. A lot of our nonprofit folks are out there that, as the director said, came in and stayed late and listened and are willing to help. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I look forward to hearing from you. There are next steps. We're going to get your feedback as we move forward and figure out how to steer things in the next direction we head in. So thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.